This is drawing condemnation really across America for good reason tonight and raising some profound questions about the national security of the United States. It is clear tonight that July 16th, 2018 will go down in our history books and as an inflection point in U.S.-Soviet relations. We're covering that from several angles tonight. We are witnessing a U.S. president bluntly siding with a Russian autocrat about the findings of U.S. intelligence agencies in an open criminal probe. Two men meeting here 3 days after Mueller indicted Russian army officers who report to the man standing next to your president right there, Vladimir Putin, over allegations those officers worked to elect him. This was a foreign policy event today unlike any other in recent history.
I address directly with President Putin the issue of Russian interference in our elections.
The Russian state has never interfered.
Just now, President Putin denied having anything to do with the election interference in 2016. Every U.S. intelligence agency has concluded that Russia did. Who do you believe?
I have President Putin. He just said it's not Russia. I will say this. I don't see any reason why it would be. President Putin was extremely strong and powerful in his denial today.
President Putin, did you want President Trump to win the election?
Yes, I did.
There was no collusion. I didn't know the president. There was nobody to collude with. It's ridiculous what's going on with the probe. I think that the United States has been foolish.
After all, I was an intelligence officer myself. And I do know how dossiers are made out.
Does the Russian government have any compromising material on President Trump or his family?
Yeah, I did heard these rumors that we allegedly collected compromising material on Mr. Trump when he was visiting Moscow. When President Trump visited Moscow back then, I didn't even know that he was in Moscow.
And I have to say, if they had it, it would have been out long ago.
Condemnation already pouring in from experts and referees alike. We've been tracking significant concern here from Democrats, from moderate Republicans, from intelligence experts, and of course, from journalists.
He took the word of the KGB over the men and women of the CIA.
Outrageous. It's something that is a disgrace and that all Americans should be ashamed of that performance.
Today turned what's been an ongoing problem of Donald Trump as president in terms of his attitude towards and behavior towards Russia, towards President Putin, has turned a problem into a crisis.
You have been watching perhaps one of the most disgraceful performances by an American president at a summit in front of a Russian leader, certainly that I've ever seen.
Disgraceful. That is a strong word. And then there's a man who tangled with Trump at the FBI going farther tonight, James Comey, writing this, quote, "This was the day an American president stood on foreign soil next to a murderous lying thug and refused to back his own country. Patriots need to stand up and reject the behavior of this president." Russia's cyber attack on American democracy has dominated American politics since 2016. First, because it was such an important threat, and then because the new administration coddled and caved to those Russian attackers instead of sanctioning them or confronting them, which of course naturally stoked even more intriguing questions about whether Donald Trump wanted, welcomed, or yes, colluded with that now alleged charged indicted help from the Russian army. On Friday, the U.S. government made the most significant case to date that Russia's attack came from the top of Putin's army. Those are the charges in the indictment. Now, whether Donald Trump and his allies were part of that conspiracy does remain an open question. Prejudging that outcome is not fair or constructive or how our rule of law works. So we don't prejudge the outcome of that probe, but tonight we can see what's happening in front of our eyes. We are living through a turning point that makes the Trump administration look exceedingly bad, because even if conspiracy and collusion are never proven, even if, say, Donald Trump is cleared of any such wrongdoing by Bob Mueller and people accept that outcome, today, the news, the facts reverberating across America are that today Donald Trump committed new wrongs, according to U.S. intelligence and national security experts, siding inexplicably or perhaps explicably, depending on your interpretation of events, but siding with Putin and the KGB over the U.S. and the CIA and the DOJ. This is a public fact tonight, regardless of what Bob Mueller ever finds in the future. we have some special guests for our coverage. And I begin tonight with David Corn, Washington Bureau Chief for Mother Jones. He has been covering the Russia probe from the very beginning and has had a series of significant scoops and a book under his belt. And so I begin with this question. What does July 16th, 2018 mean in the Russia probe?
Well, I think the question is whether we've hit an inflection point. If you ask me, did Donald Trump say anything new today that he hasn't said before, the answer is no. For 2 years, during the campaign and as president, he has continually denied that Russia was involved, even after he was briefed as a candidate by the U.S. intelligence community, and even as he became president after the intelligence community put out a more deeper assessment and said this had been done to help him. He has denied in the last couple of weeks, you know this, Ari, we've talked about this, you know, he put out a tweet saying Russia says they didn't meddle, and he called Putin fine. So I think what we see today is a very dramatic, clarifying moment when he was asked by an American reporter, do you stand with Putin or you stand with your own government? We're not just talking about the spy agencies. We're talking about the Justice Department and the House and Senate Intelligence Committees run by Republicans who've all said the same thing. Who do you stand with? And he said, well, you know, they both have a point. No, they both don't have a point. And this brings me to what I wrote about this afternoon is this is evidence of collusion. Not collusion in the initial attack, which you talked about we don't have a clear picture on, but it's collusion from the very beginning in the cover-up. Putin's been putting out disinformation from the very beginning saying we're not involved, and Trump has colluded with that cover-up by amplifying that message. And a key question is, when they had that private meeting today, 90 minutes or longer, did they talk about what they would say about this matter when they came out for the press conference? If they did, then Trump, by any definition of the word, colluded with Putin to help him put forward this cover-up and this stonewalling. And while that may not be a crime, I don't know, I'm not a lawyer, you are, but it is certainly an act of betrayal that I think is reverberating strongly today because of the dramatic moment that we all witnessed.
Well, your piece today drives very much towards the question of how does the sitting president deal with these charges as of Friday that indict the Russian army. I mean, that this was a cyber attack of a criminal nature, of an international conspiracy. And so, to your point, yes, we've heard many things from Donald Trump, and we've heard him say many things that are false and that we believe are clearly lies based on what he knows. But this feels and looks and may legally be different because he is up there with the person that those now indicted individuals report to and is saying these things. So in that respect, do you think that there's a receptivity to that point? Why, I guess, for viewers watching, why does that matter? Completely separate from whatever Mueller finds happened in 2016. And for those who look at abuse of power questions, is it also potentially worse for a president to be doing this as president as opposed to a private citizen who's a candidate running for future plans?
The FBI investigated this case under Robert Mueller's tutelage, and they came up with this indictment, which is maybe just the beginning. It's 12 Russian military officials. The Justice Department, you know, had to sign off on this indictment. Rod Rosenstein, excuse me, presented it to us on Friday. That brings the imprimatur of the Justice Department on this. So here you have Donald Trump out there saying he doesn't give a damn what his own Justice Department, what his own FBI, you know, how many people worked on this case? Dozens, if not scores. What they came up with, he's standing next to the man who the intelligence agencies have said ordered this attack. So he's part of this criminal conspiracy, and in fact, the indictment says there are other people we're not naming in this conspiracy yet. That may well be Vladimir Putin, maybe an unindicted co-conspirator. So he's standing next to this fellow, and he's providing him cover. He is giving him the benefit of the doubt, and he's basically saying to the vast law enforcement services of the United States and the intelligence services, I don't care what you say. Your facts don't matter to me. I'm with Vlad. I'm with Vlad. That was the message today, and I'm still shocked that more Republicans, some have spoken out about it, they're still tiptoeing around this.
We have more on that in the hour. Again, it's a relative matter, but McCain, Paul Ryan, some of them have gone a little bit further, but probably not to the scale of what we're witnessing, which is just truly extreme conduct by a president. Stay with me. I want to add to the conversation former intelligence officer Malcolm Nance, the author of The Plot to Destroy America, and Wall Street Journal reporter Shelby Holliday, who's been covering this case. Malcolm, take a listen to another supremely noticeable, bizarre, or disturbing, depending on your point of view, thing that the president said about how Hillary Clinton would be treated in Russia.
What happened to Hillary Clinton's emails? 33,000 emails gone, just gone. I think in Russia they wouldn't be gone so easily. I have great confidence in my intelligence people, but I will tell you that President Putin was extremely strong and powerful in his denial today.
Do you think Americans should be angry, worried, concerned based on what we saw today? Malcolm?
Well, what they should be is shocked and disgusted. I know I am. When I heard that today, my jaw dropped to the floor. I could not believe a president of the United States went to a foreign nation, an adversary nation, not a competitor, an adversary, and insulted the American political system, the American intelligence agency, American law enforcement, the U.S. Congress, an opposition party, and in essence surrendered this nation's opinions to a foreign power and believed a former KGB officer over that of the men and women who walk past the statue of Nathan Hale every day and sold this nation down the river. I'm sorry. What we saw here today is not just Donald Trump aligning himself with Vladimir Putin. We saw the beginning of the realignment of the entire world order since World War II, and Trump and Putin are the only two people, as David said, who knows what was said in that meeting.
It's well put, and it's chilling, Shelby, and it's about U.S. foreign policy. This is not about 2016. This is not about people rooting for Bob Mueller to create political outcomes that otherwise might not be created.
Right.
As I've emphasized in our reporting tonight, put that all aside. Do the thought experiment that Bob Mueller doesn't indict anyone else, and that's the end of the road. And we just witnessed today something that I don't think people are going to fully absorb for some time to come. Here is also new sound from Donald Trump from another interview he did that's part of this whole Putin defense campaign, also undercutting his own intel chief. Take a look.
Your DNI, Dan Coates, said that America's digital infrastructure is at a critical point right now, similar to what it was like in some ways before 9/11, and that is we're susceptible to a large-scale attack. Do you agree with that?
Well, I don't know if I agree with that. I'd have to look.
The idea that he does not agree, quote unquote, that he has separate fact-finding than the entire military intelligence apparatus.
Well, and he said that standing side by side with Putin. He repeated debunked conspiracy theories about the DNC server, about the Pakistani who worked alongside Debbie Wasserman Schultz. He cast a lot of doubt on the investigation in general. He also called the Mueller probe disgraceful and a disaster, and he blamed the probe for the tension with Russia, not Russia's meddling. So in addition to all of the other things he said and did today, this is what's really affecting Republicans on the Hill. I've been talking to some Republicans who are on intelligence committees, and they think this is very problematic for two reasons. If the president doesn't trust the intelligence agency's assessment, how can we ever secure our cyber defenses? How can we ever have cybersecurity in this nation if he simply doesn't believe them? And secondly, he is so worried about his election and how it is viewed that this investigation is driving his policy. And that is scary, not just for Democrats, but for Republicans alike in Congress.
Right, and you're reporting on what Republicans are telling you. Malcolm, briefly, there's a less benign view, which is that this is not about simply defending the legitimacy of his election, but rather he or people around him may be under legal scrutiny for how they welcomed what is now charged criminal conduct by the Russian army.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And we know right there in plain sight when conspiracy, at least on one count, occurred. And that was when he called upon Russian intelligence and the Kremlin to release Hillary Clinton's emails. And what you saw was this flurry of activity from Russian military intelligence. That happened in plain sight, as did his lack of concern about anything that could happen to the United States in the cybersphere, his lack of concern about how we fired the FBI director in order to get rid of them for the Russian, to get rid of the Russian probe. I don't think he understands what reality is in the rest of the world. He has a meta-narrative around him that is Donald Trump can do no wrong, and he believes nothing in the world except for his friend Vladimir Putin and his base, all of whom are the same to him, are the only people that he should listen to, talk to, and everyone else be damned.
And we've been talking about also how this is playing in Congress, where there are many seasoned intelligence experts with this portfolio. I want to turn to California Congressman Eric Swalwell, who's one of them, serving both on the Intelligence and Judiciary committees. Where does today rate, in your view, of the Trump administration?
Lower than I thought we ever could go, Ari. There may have been an American flag on that stage, but I did not see an American president. I saw two defenders of Russia, and I saw a president whose primary role, his principal responsibility is to defend the United States, and he sided with Russia. But we're not helpless here in Congress. Our founders gave us an opportunity to stand up and defend the United States. We should do all we can to protect the Mueller investigation and solidify that in law. We should pass an independent commission to take this outside of Congress so the American people can understand what happened. And we should devote every resource possible to address the concern that DNI, Dan Coats, has raised, that our grid and our election systems could be compromised. We can do all of that. I've seen the tweets. I've heard the talk from my Republican colleagues. Talk is cheap. What will you do legislatively? What will you do with your vote?
As an intelligence committee member, what was your view of Vladimir Putin today? Donald Trump met with him and then held this public reward in a way. Barack Obama, as president, declined to hold these kind of joint press conferences. Did you feel that Vladimir Putin looked even-keeled, emboldened, intimidated? What was your view of the way he was representing Russia against the United States?
Well, Ari, it's All-Star Week here in Washington, D.C. He won the home run derby of all derbies. Vladimir Putin got an American president to come to Finland to meet with him, and we didn't get anything out of it. We're not bringing home the 12 individuals who were indicted. We didn't make any progress in Syria. We didn't make any progress with Ukraine, and we're no safer as we go into the next election. I think this was a big victory for Vladimir Putin. But again, what will the U.S. Congress do now? Because our president has left his office helpless to act, but we are not. And I call on my Republican colleagues.
And the final question I want to ask you that we're going to be covering later in the hour, what was your interpretation of Vladimir Putin's rather odd references to the dossier and to putting dossiers together?
He's an intelligence officer, and he knows exactly, what is alleged, what is out there, and he knows what he is guilty of. And the problem is he sees somebody who is completely unwilling to confront him about it, and so he sees nothing but green lights to conduct further operations. And that's what's so terrifying, is we're about 100 days away from the midterm election, and we need to do all we can to protect the ballot box, because Vladimir Putin sees an open road right now, and we need some stoplights.
Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.